the mighty Ottoman Empire collapsed during both talks and gunfire. The Republic of Turkey, the man who managed to unify the Turks into a strong state when the empire they themselves had founded was faltering, was not only an extraordinary military leader, but also a meticulous politician and statesman. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, which literally means father of the Turks, is the most popular figure in modern Turkey. A man who, after notable feats in war, became the first president of Turkey until his death. For some, he was the savior of Turkey and a great architect of the modernization and secularization of the former Ottoman state. While for others, he was someone who turned his back on Turkish tradition, seeking to forcibly Europeanize and Westernize the Ottoman people. His story, more extraordinary and complex than it seems, is also the story of the end of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of Turkey, and today we're going to learn about it. This is Ronaldo Carrillo speaking to you. Today I invite you to follow our new channel, Mysteries of History, where I, Ronaldo Carrillo, will narrate videos on many fascinating topics. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. The link will appear here on the screen, so you can check out what we've published, so you can join, subscribe, and learn as much, and enjoy it as much as we do. Without further ado, let's start with today's story. The man who would later be known as Ataturk was born into a middle-class family around 1881 with the name Mustafa. He was born in a 3-story house in the old city of Salonika, now in Greece. At that time, Salonika was a prosperous port and an integral part of the Ottoman Empire. His father was Ali Riza Effendi, originally from Salonika, a customs official and merchant, while his mother Zubaydi Hanim came from an agricultural community in the same region. Of the 6 children they had in their marriage, only Mustafa and his sister Makbule Ataden would reach adulthood. What we know today as the Ottoman Empire was officially called the Sublime Ottoman State and was known in its time as the Turkish Empire. The Turks were a people from the steppes of Central Asia who had adopted the Muslim religion, and under the leadership of the Osmanli family, they had founded a state in 1299 in the historic peninsula of Anatolia, territory that today is part of Turkey. This Turkish state, founded by the Osmanli family, would become a huge and vigorous political entity that came to extend across 3 continents at its height during the 16th and 17th centuries, questioned as a formidable Muslim military machine. The seat of this empire was the ancient city of Constantinople, center of several other empires, conquered by the Ottomans in 1453, a city now known as Istanbul. In Turkey, some have considered the Ottoman Empire as the Islamic successor to the ancient classical empires, such as the Roman or Byzantine. The young Mustafa was born 6 centuries after the founding of this enormous political entity, in one of its most emblematic provinces. In addition, during his childhood, the modern and liberal values instilled in him by his father stood out, different from the religiosity of his mother. It's one reason he enrolled his son in secular modern schools for that era. At the age of 7, however, his father died, but these values endured in his son's life. Could the military cadet uniforms Mustafa saw in his Saloniki neighborhood have been the reason? This might have sparked his initial attraction and eventual decision to pursue a career in the army. Against his mother's wishes, Mustafa takes the entrance exam and is admitted to the military school. At the military school, Mustafa stands out remarkably among the others. A sign of this is that he receives the nickname Kemal from his mathematics teacher, which would mean something similar to the word maturity, although other sources indicated that it meant something similar to the word perfect. From then on, our protagonist began to be known as Mustafa Kemal. By the year 1895, Mustafa enters the Monastir Military High School, located in North Macedonia. Then he enters the Istanbul War College in March of 1899. Istanbul, once known as Constantinople, was impressive. During his stay, he enjoys the freedom and sophistication of the city's high culture. In high school, he shows great intelligence, talents, and personality, earning the sincere love and respect of classmates and superiors. Mustafa, a young blond man with blue eyes and good height, with a great interest in military lessons. Since then, he was already known for his reputation as an intellectual and a revolutionary, and he showed interest in major national affairs, while he expressed his thoughts openly and had a vision for the future. The Ottoman Empire was ruled throughout its existence by a sultanate, a hereditary monarchy that remained within the Osmanli family. For more than 6 centuries of the empire's existence, the Sultan held all the sovereign power of his kingdom. However, Ottoman regions were still influenced by modern and republican ideas that emerged after the 18th century. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was already under considerable pressure from European powers to adapt its country to Western political forms. And as early as 1876, the Ottoman state had tried an experiment with constitutional monarchy in which the Sultan was losing power. Various internal currents within the Ottoman Empire. They sought to establish a secular republic, as was the trend in the West, or at least to introduce modern reforms to the Ottoman state, which was a state with a strong religious spirit. At the war school, a dissident movement was forming against the Sultan at the time, Abdülhamid II. But Mustafa Kemal stayed out of this until the 3rd year, when he got involved in producing an underground newspaper against the Sultan. His activities were discovered. But even so, he managed to graduate as a 2nd lieutenant in 1902, ranking among the top 10 in his class of more than 450 students. Then, in 1905, he graduated as a captain from the Staff College, thus becoming one of the main young officers of the empire. After discovering the military groups that Mustafa was forming with his friends to discuss politics, Mustafa Kemal was briefly imprisoned and then sent to a remote area of the empire, to the 5th Army in Damascus in Syria. But despite this, Mustafa persists in anti-government activities. In October 1906, he helps found a secret group called the Society for the Fatherland. Freedom, with branches in cities like Beirut, Jaffa, and Jerusalem. He secretly travels to Salonika to open a branch of the group. Although the government finds out about his trip, he is not punished because his superiors decided to protect him. Soon after, the so-called Committee of Union and Progress arrives in Salonika. This was the official name of a nationalist and reformist movement that was popularly known as the Young Turks. The Young Turks had emerged from secret societies of university students and military cadets who operated clandestinely, because in 1878 the Sultan had suspended both the parliament and the guarantees of the constitution. This movement reached a level of influence and power that by 1908, very soon after Mustafa became involved in this movement, this group led a revolution that forced the Sultan Abdülhamid II to restore the Constitution of 1876, proclaiming a new constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary assembly, in addition to appointing a sort of prime minister who would be a member of the Young Turks. From that moment on, the Young Turks Party became the center of Ottoman politics. However, in contrast to the leaders of the Young Turks, Mustafa believed that greater and more radical changes needed to be made. Taking advantage of the circumstances, he declared the principle of republican equality and separated religious affairs from governmental matters. On April 13, 1909, a major rebellion erupted in Istanbul, backed by Islamist groups opposed to the previous year's revolution, which restored the constitution. In response, Mustafa is appointed Chief of Staff of the Action Army to suppress the rebellion. Mustafa leads the troops effectively and writes the declaration addressed to the public on the day the movement's army enters Istanbul. When the troops finally take control of the situation, the Young Turks force Sultan Abdülhamid II to abdicate, and Sultan Mehmed V is appointed in his place, whose power was seriously limited. After less than 2 years of changing the Sultan and government, Mustafa Kemal returned to Thessaloniki to resume his duties. His activities in the military and political world continued to attract the attention or displeasure of his superiors. However, only 2 years after the change of government and the change of sultan in the Ottoman state, as a result of a nationalist and expansionist fervor that existed in the Kingdom of Italy, in 1911 the Italians launched themselves onto North African territory in their imperial aspiration to regain control of the Mediterranean Sea. Italy attacked the Ottoman provinces of Tripolitania, Fezzan, and Cyrenaica, which together make up present-day Libya. These were the last Ottoman colonies on African territory. After Italy secured part of the control of Libya, it launched a strong army against the Ottoman region in September 1911. Thus, the Italo-Turkish War begins, and Mustafa was one of the commanders sent by the Ottoman Empire to repel the invasion, with regular troops and local Arab and Bedouin militia. Although the Italian troops outnumbered them, the Turks and Arabs won several battles against the Romans, and Mustafa's role was key in those victories. His reputation as a military man kept rising. In November 1911, Mustafa was promoted to major, but in 1912, an Italian bombing injured his eye, leaving him partially blind for life. Mustafa must exit the war, and after fierce fighting, the larger Italian army prevailed and forced the Ottoman Empire to sign a treaty where they relinquished control of 3 provinces that would become Italian Libya. This added to a series of territorial losses that the Ottoman state had been suffering since the 19th century, like the example of Bulgaria, a century in which the influence, in addition to that of the European powers, over Ottoman politics had become much stronger. While Mustafa was recovering from his eye injury, in 1912 he received news of another major outbreak, known as the First Balkan War, in which countries like Montenegro, Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria grouped together in the Balkan League, attacked the Ottoman Empire in order to expel it from Europe once and for all, in the regions of those countries that were still under Ottoman control. Mustafa was sent to fight, and after a year of hard war, by the end of 1912, the Balkan League defeated the forces of the Ottoman Empire, including Mustafa's troops, in the early stages of the conflict. But a misunderstanding among the European powers after the victory, it ended up triggering the Second Balkan War the following year, in which everyone would fight against Bulgaria. In that war, the Ottomans regained much of their lost territory. However, all of this would be a small episode compared to the storm that was approaching in Europe and other parts of the world, because by 1914, the tensions between the Kingdom of Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian monarchy would lead to a declaration of war, which was joined by the various European powers in what eventually became the First World War. According to Mustafa's view, the Ottoman Empire should have stayed out of this great war. However, the Ottoman state joined the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire on October 29, 1914, at Mustafa's insistence that he be sent into combat. He is appointed commander of the 19th Division, which would be stationed in Teydar, in Turkey, on January 20th, 1914. On the Gallipoli Peninsula, Allied troops attempt to advance toward the Ottoman Empire's heart. However, Mustafa repels several enemy landings and inflicts heavy casualties on Allied forces, including Greek troops. The Ottomans were fighting for the unity of their historic empire, and the battle was fierce in this intense defense of the peninsula by the Ottomans. Mustafa's troops received an order from him that became engraved in the Turkish imagination. "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die." Mustafa and his soldiers' heroic defense at Gallipoli put him on the world stage. That's how Mustafa was promoted to colonel on June 1, 1915. The British made no progress after months of landings and eventually withdrew. In this way, Mustafa's leadership, even though they were outnumbered, prevented the British from taking Istanbul. Mustafa returns to Istanbul and is promoted to general on April 1, 1916. That year, he was sent to the Russian front and was the only Turkish general to defeat the Russians on the Eastern Front. But beyond this, the Ottoman troops were being overwhelmed by the Allied forces. When Mustafa returns to Istanbul, he develops kidney problems. During the war years, there was also a strong persecution by the Ottoman government of the Young Turks against Armenians and Greeks within Ottoman territory. Meanwhile, Mustafa was recuperating overseas. In 1918, Sultan Mehmed V died, and a new member of the Osmanli family took the throne, with the name Mehmed VI. The new sultan assigned Mustafa Kemal to command the Ottoman troops that were collapsing in Syria. But this battle was going to stop on October 30, 1918. Facing imminent defeat, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros with the Allied powers, which meant not only defeat, but to a large extent, the dissolution of the once feared Ottoman Empire. The Turks had to give up all provinces except Anatolia, where Turks were the majority, and hand over their lands to the Allied forces. The Allies took control of the government of Istanbul, and in an attempt to ensure the continuity of his rule, Sultan Mehmed VI offered to cooperate with the Allies. While Turkey made the concessions agreed upon in the armistice, the armies of Mustafa and the Ottoman Empire in general had been dissolved, divided, and their weapons surrendered. Returning on November 13, 1919 to Istanbul, just as the ships of the Allied fleet were sailing through the famous Istanbul Strait. This scene in Mustafa's mind, as well as the occupation of the Turkish city by the Allied troops, left a lasting impression on our protagonist, more determined than ever to expel the invader. Facing the de facto and de jure occupation of Anatolia and its former provinces by Turkey, Mustafa begins to meet with a select group of friends to plan actions that will respond to this. Across Anatolia, Turks responded to foreign occupation by forming associations and paramilitary groups to protect their interests. These nationalist armed groups began clashing with local non-Muslims and others cooperating with the Allies. Everything suggested they might soon fight the occupation troops. Mustafa has been sent by the government of Istanbul to neutralize these rebellious guerrilla groups and to restore order. But our protagonist had other plans. For some, the modern history of Turkey begins on the morning of May 19, 1919. When Mustafa disembarks on the Anatolian coast disobeying official orders, he heads inland where there were rebel troops and political allies. Amid victories and applause, Mustafa, already nationally famous for his war exploits, tells a crowd that the Sultan and Turkish people were prisoners of the Allied forces, and that he had come to Anatolia to prevent the nation from being completely d'ensemble. The Sultan, pressured by the Allies, removes Mustafa from his military post, although he had already formally resigned beforehand to avoid being dismissed. The Sultan telegraphs all provincial governors, ordering them to ignore Mustafa Kemal's orders, and imperial orders for his arrest are circulated. Although he no longer had official status, Officer Qasim Karabekir joins Mustafa Kemal, putting his troops at his disposal. This would be a crucial first alliance in the struggle for Turkish independence. His companion calls a congress of all the associations and movements that were defending Turkish sovereignty. With the Congress convened in 1919 and a strong national movement of young Turks, Mustafa Kemal was elected head of the Congress and leader of the Turkish independence movement. The Congress proclaims a provisional government and drafts a document in which they claimed sovereignty over the 6 eastern provinces of the former Ottoman state. The new provisional government restores Mustafa's military rank and decorations, and seeing that the Sultan was unable to free the country from occupation, he somehow disregards him. He sets up his provisional government's headquarters in Ankara, now Turkey's capital. The main nationalist supporters in Istanbul are arrested by the Allied forces and their Turkish collaborators. The country's direction is uncertain. Besides the foreign forces, there were 2 governments, one led by the Sultan and another by Mustafa Kemal. On their side, there were also conservative Ottoman groups who opposed Mustafa and the nationalists. In this way, armies of caliphs and sultans were being formed against the national forces organized in Anatolia by Mustafa. Several former war heroes, including Mustafa, were now seen as rebels and sentenced to death by the Istanbul government. And to make the situation even more complicated, the post-war territorial arrangements were causing conflicts between provinces of the former empire and neighboring provinces like Armenia and Greece, creating a mosaic of complex internal conflicts. Since the regular Ottoman army was dissolved, Mustafa and the Turkish national movement had to fight with various irregular troops, mainly made up of local forces and volunteer detachments. The Greeks, aligned with the Allies and seeking their own territorial gains, attacked in 1920 to advance into Anatolia. In the midst of this, the Armenians also went to war against the Turkish national movement due to territorial conflicts. However, the provisional government had managed to gain great strength in a short time, mainly, among other things, thanks to the prestige of Mustafa. And in a short time, their troops managed to take control of the situation and began to achieve great successes on several fronts against enemy forces. Turkish troops, led by Kasim Karabekir, defeated the Armenians in December 1920, reclaiming 3 occupied Turkish provinces. In other regions, violent clashes occurred between French troops and local forces, where the French forces had to retreat against the Turks. Meanwhile, the Greeks advanced toward Ankara, the capital. However, Mustafa's Turkish army stands firm and pushes the Greeks back on January 10, 1921, in the First Battle of Inonu. After this victory, on March 20, 1921, the national movement has the first constitution approved in the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. With this, efforts to create a regular army for the new provisional government, which was its main weakness, were accelerated. Mustafa led national forces with cunning and determination in a complex landscape. The Greeks persisted, making things more difficult for the Turks. Mustafa takes on the role of commander-in-chief and throws himself into battle. After several maneuvers, he manages to push the Greeks back in September 1921 and then launches another offensive in 1922, which pushed the Greek troops into the sea at Izmir. With these battles, the Ottoman Turks had gotten rid of most of the Allied and non-Turkish forces in the territory of ancient Anatolia. General Mustafa had achieved victory for the national movement. And in the midst of these advances, and having also weakened the internal conservative forces of Turkey, the Grand National Assembly voted in November 1922 to abolish the Sultanate. Sultan Mehmet VI was thus deposed from his position, and the Turkish monarchy as an institution was abolished. Subsequently, on October 29, 1922, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed with its own sovereignty and territory. After this event, presidential elections were announced. Mustafa Kemal, Ankara's representative, won the war. Highly prestigious and also known as someone deeply interested in and knowledgeable about the country's problems, he is unanimously elected as the first president of the Republic of Turkey. Once Mustafa assumes command of the Republic, he embarks on a broad process of reforms to turn the Republic into what could be called a modern 20th century state, in the Western-style secular, based on republican and secular ideas of European origin. Ataturk's nationalism was one that considered the Turks as heirs also of ancient Constantinople, and therefore also heirs of the classical European tradition. His secular westernization reforms were carried out at a remarkably fast pace. Ataturk enjoyed enormous prestige and ruled almost without opposition, at least for 10 years. The uncovered conspiracies resulted in their leaders being executed in a region recently emerged from harsh wartime conditions. However, Mustafa tried to lead a process of democratization and pacification. By 1931, the Republican People's Party, founded by Mustafa, defined the 6 ideological principles of the regime: Republican, Nationalist, Populist, Statist, Secular, and Revolutionary. In March 1924, one of the first measures was taken after the Sultanate's abolition. In 1922, it was the abolition of the Ministry of Sacred Law and the Caliphate, where the Sultan had been the nominal head of the Islamic faith. At the same time, religious schools were dismantled and placed under the control of the Ministry of Education. And by April of that same year, the abolition of religious courts was carried out. By 1925, the use of the fez, a hat previously worn by the Turks, was prohibited, as they considered this hat a feudal symbol. And from then on, they began to wear Western-style clothing. Mustafa dressed in the European style and encouraged others to do the same. The use of the veil for women was also prohibited, and they were encouraged to wear Western dresses and join the workforce. At the same time, the Islamic law system was discarded, and in 1926, a different civil penal and commercial code was adopted, inspired by France and Germany. As a result of these measures, polygamy was abolished, marriage became a civil contract, and divorce was recognized as a lawful civil action. Although most Turks see Ataturk as the father and savior of their country, many accuse him of being a secular extremist, for trying to copy European countries at any cost. According to his own words, Mustafa Kemal believed that secularism and the Europeanization of Turkey were the best means to transform his country into a modern nation. Thus, he contrasts himself with other forms of nationalism. A revolutionary reform was replacing the Arabic alphabet used for centuries to write Ottoman Turkish with the Latin alphabet. This measure was officially implemented in November 1928, and then Turkey moved towards one of the highest literacy rates in the Middle East, while at the same time somewhat repressed by the Ottoman regime. Mustafa promotes culture and the visual and plastic arts based on the Turkish legacy, but also drawing heavily from European humanism. At the same time, Mustafa encourages the youth of Turkey to study in Europe and to get closer to Western education. Another important step in his administration was the establishment of surnames, as we commonly know them today, in 1934. It is at this moment and in this sense that the Assembly gives Mustafa Kemal the surname Ataturk, which in the composition of its words means father of the Turks. Until that moment, Mustafa had managed to firmly establish Turkey within its national borders and was leading it down the path of Western modernization. He guarantees a stable, orderly government and later aims to develop his country's foreign policy similarly. His country made no territorial or irredentist claims, meaning none based on past aspirations or historical possessions, except for the eventual incorporation of the region of Alexandretta, which he considered to be included within the boundaries established by the National Pact. Likewise, in 1934, Turkey is one of the first countries in the world to grant women the right to vote and to be elected as members of parliament. In practice, Mustafa becomes a secular sultan, the leader who guaranteed unity during his final years. He remodels the Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul, the former main residence of the sultans, where he spends most of his time. His health begins to deteriorate because he drank a lot and ate very little, until he was later diagnosed with liver cirrhosis. after enduring the pain of the last months of his life with great character and dignity. The man who was born as Mustafa and would later be known as Ataturk passed away on November 10, 1938 at 9:05 in the morning in Dolmabahce in his palace. After 16 years of government and more than 10 years fighting in the war, Ataturk was one of those men who earned widespread respect from his people, beyond ideologies or tendencies. His modernization efforts remain debated by those who say he tried to forcibly westernize the country, Turkey. Those who honor him as the savior and father of the Turkish nation remember that after fighting in over 4 wars and leading Turkey for 15 years, all that remains is his people's memory. And the debate among historians about a rare case where a historical figure is almost universally praised, unanimously. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and invite you to subscribe to our new channel, Mysteries of History. We will publish unique, exclusive, and fascinating content on many historical topics. Below in the description and in the comments, you'll be able to find the link so you can join and check out what we've posted. Also, don't forget to leave your comments on this channel and on this video. Give it a like, activate the notification bell, and follow us on our Instagram account called La Nueva Enciclopedia. That's all. Goodbye and God bless you all.